There's a Costco on the waterfront in Homestead, Pennsylvania. That's it. That's the whole story, right? A big box store on a riverbank, a parking lot full of minivans, a multiplex showing superhero films, some condos with river views. Nothing to see here, nothing to remember. Just another post-industrial American town that figured it out, cleaned itself up, moved on. Except it didn't. And what was erased from that riverbank? What was bulldozed and auctioned and quietly buried under 40 acres of discount retail was once the single most productive industrial complex in the history of the United States. A place so vital, so enormous, so savagely productive that without it, the Allies might have lost the Second World War. A place that employed 10,000 men at its peak. 10,000. Working in heat so intense it turned their skin permanent shades of orange and red, breathing air so thick with sulfur and coal dust that the doctors who treated them stopped being surprised when lungs came out black at autopsy. A place where, in the summer of 1892, workers faced down an army of hired mercenaries on the banks of the Monongahela River and won, in a battle that should be taught in every American school, but somehow never is. The Homestead Steel Works. Gone. Demolished. Scrapped. And the politicians who watched it happen, who gave speeches about its future while signing off on its death. Most of them are still in office. This is the story of how America built its industrial spine on the backs of men it was already planning to throw away. And how, when the time came to throw them away, the country barely flinched. Let's go back. Not to the collapse. Not yet. First, you need to understand what was actually here, what was actually lost, because the numbers alone will not do it. You need to feel the scale of this thing before you can understand the scale of the crime. The Monongahela River Valley, southeast of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. 1875. The valley is already scarred. The hills on both sides are stripped of timber, the river running brown with runoff from upstream mines. But what's coming to Homestead, Pennsylvania, to this particular bend in the river, is something that will make everything that came before look modest. Andrew Carnegie is about to build a cathedral, not a cathedral of God. Carnegie didn't build those. Carnegie built cathedrals of iron, of steel, of tonnage and profit and organized human suffering on a scale the world had genuinely never seen. And the site he chose, a flat stretch of riverbank in a small borough across the water from Pittsburgh, would become, within a decade, the most concentrated site of industrial production on Earth. The Homestead Steel Works. At full operation, the complex stretched nearly 1.5 miles along the Monongahela River. 40-some acres of furnaces, rolling mills, blooming mills, plate mills, open hearth furnaces, machine shops, rail yards, and river docks. The structures were not buildings in any conventional sense. They were iron-framed caverns the size of airplane hangars, open at their ends to the river wind, roofed in corrugated metal that buckled and sang in winter storms. Inside, overhead cranes moved through the smoke like prehistoric birds. Ladles of molten steel, each one capable of killing every man on the floor if it tipped wrong, swung through the air on chains the thickness of a man's thigh. The heat. You need to understand the heat. At the furnace mouths, temperatures reached 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The men who worked closest to the open hearths wore wooden-soled shoes because leather burned. They kept buckets of water nearby, not for drinking. The water evaporated before it reached their lips, but to soak rags that they tied around their wrists, their necks, the backs of their knees. In summer, The interior temperature of the mill could reach 130 degrees at the floor level, and the men who worked the night shift, the 12-hour night shift, 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year, would emerge at dawn looking like they had survived something. Because they had. And the ones who didn't survive, the ones who fell into a ladle, who were caught under a crane, who breathed the wrong cloud at the wrong moment, who were crushed by a steel plate the weight of a locomotive. Their deaths were filed under industrial accident, recorded in a ledger, and somebody new was hired the following Monday. Now here is the first thing nobody tells you. The men who built the Homestead Steel Works, who operated it, who were broken by it, who died inside it, were not, in the main, the men the history books mention. The history books mention Carnegie. They mention Henry Clay Frick. They mention a handful of Union leaders. They mention the Pinkerton detectives who came by barge in 1892 and were met by rifle fire. The history books do not spend much time on John, or Mihail, or Stanisław, or Joseph, or the man everyone called Big Pete, whose real name was Petro Kovalenko, and who came from a village in western Ukraine in 1901 speaking no English, and found work at Homestead within 3 days of arriving, because the mill ate men so fast it could never stop hiring. These are the forgotten architects of American industrial power. Slovak steel workers who packed into company boarding houses 6 men to a room and sent money home every month for years before they could afford to bring their families over. Hungarian rollers who learned the job not from any training program. There was no training program, but from standing next to a man who'd been doing it for 5 years and watching his hands until they understood what their own hands were supposed to do. Polish furnace workers, Serbian mill hands. Black laborers from the American South who came north looking for wages that didn't involve sharecropping and found Homestead, found the worst and most dangerous jobs in the mill, found discrimination so baked into the wage structure that they were often paid less for the same work, and stayed anyway, because the alternative was worse. These men are the character spine of this story, not the Carnegies, not the politicians, not the CEOs who will appear later. The ones who dismantled what these men built while collecting 8-figure bonuses. The men who built this place, with their hands, with their lungs, with years of their lives they could not get back. They deserve to be at the center of this. By 1900, the Homestead Works was producing more steel than all of Great Britain. Read that again. More steel than all of Great Britain. 1 mill, on 1 river, in 1 Pennsylvania borough of fewer than 20,000 people. The rails that stitched together the American continent. Homestead. The structural plates that gave the Brooklyn Bridge its bones. Homestead. The armor plating on the USS Maine, on the battleships of the Great White Fleet, on the destroyers and cruisers that made the U.S. Navy an actual force in the Pacific. Homestead. The girders that held up the skyscrapers of Chicago and Manhattan as they rose, floor by floor, into the American sky. Homestead. The country that existed in 1920, the country that was, by then, unambiguously the most powerful industrial nation on Earth, was built in no small part on 1.5 miles of riverbank in western Pennsylvania by men whose names are not on any monument, whose contributions are not in any museum, and whose grandchildren now live in a borough where the main employer is a Costco. But here's where the story turns. Because for all the iron and the fire and the impossible productivity, the Homestead Steel Works was also the site of something else. something that the Carnegie Steel Company spent years and enormous sums of money trying to prevent, then suppress, then erase from the American memory. A battle, not a metaphor, an actual battle, with rifles and cannon fire and men bleeding on the riverbank in the full light of a July morning. 1892. The year the workers of Homestead decided they had had enough, and the year the most powerful industrialist in the world decided he would rather burn the place down than negotiate. That battle, the Homestead Strike of 1892, changed everything. It changed labor law, changed the balance of power between capital and workers, changed the political landscape of the Gilded Age, and set a pattern of corporate violence against organized workers that would replay itself over and over for the next 100 years. And it ended, as these things always end, with the workers losing. But the story doesn't stop there. Because what happened to Homestead, to the mill, to the workers, to the borough itself, in the century after that defeat, is a story about something even darker than a single battle. It's a story about how a community can be kept alive just long enough to be useful, and then discarded the moment it isn't. How 10,000 jobs can simply stop existing, announced by a press release, ratified by a politician's shrug. How the most productive industrial site in American history can be sold for scrap, demolished, and replaced, and how the people responsible for that demolition can stand at the podium and call it a revitalization. How the most brutal word in the industrial vocabulary isn't fire or flood or strike. It's redevelopment. The Homestead Works reached its absolute peak in the years surrounding the Second World War. By 1943, the mill was operating 24 hours a day, every day, 365 days a year. It was producing armor plate for Sherman tanks, deck plate for aircraft carriers, gun forgings for naval artillery. The workers who had been there for 20 years were working alongside men and women. Women for the first time, because the war had emptied the borough of young men, who had never set foot in a steel mill 12 months earlier and were now operating rolling equipment that could kill them in a heartbeat. The borough of Homestead in 1943 looked nothing like the sleepy bedroom community that exists today. 8th Avenue, the main commercial street, was 40 blocks of packed humanity. Restaurants open around the clock to feed workers coming off the midnight shift at 3 in the morning. Hardware stores and work boot shops and small groceries run by Slovak and Polish families who had been in the borough for 40 years. A Carnegie library that Carnegie himself had funded, with characteristic self-congratulatory ambiguity, in 1898, 6 years after his hired detectives had shot the workers who built his fortune. The black community of Homestead, centered on 6th and 7th Avenues, in a neighborhood called the Ward, was a world unto itself. Segregated by the informal but absolute geography of a mill town, the black steel workers of Homestead had built something extraordinary inside that segregation. Churches, businesses, fraternal organizations, a dense social fabric woven from the shared experience of doing the hardest work in the mill and being last in line for the promotions and the raises and the union protections that white workers took for granted. These were not people waiting for someone to save them. These were people who had built a life, a real, complex, rooted life, in the shadow of a furnace, in a river valley where the sky was the color of dirty brass from October to April, and they were proud of what they'd made. Proud of the mill even knowing what the mill cost them. Because the mill was also the paycheck, the pension, the house with the paid-off mortgage, the kids in the parochial school, the retirement that was actually a retirement and not a slow, desperate improvisation. That is what was at stake. That is what was lost. And the loss did not happen overnight. It happened in slow motion over decades, announced repeatedly by a series of men in suits who used words like modernization and restructuring and global competitiveness. While the furnaces went cold, one by one, and the workers went home to houses that were suddenly, quietly, worth less than they'd been the year before. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before the collapse, there was the machinery of the place itself, and you need to understand what was actually happening inside those buildings before you can understand what it meant when they went dark. The open hearth furnaces at Homestead each held 250 tons of molten steel. 250 tons. Each charge, a single heat, in mill language, took 8 hours from the loading of raw materials to the pouring of finished steel. And there were not one or two of these furnaces. At peak operation, Homestead had 45 open hearths running simultaneously, each one tended by a crew of men who knew its individual temperament. Because these furnaces had temperaments. They had moods. They ran hot or cold, depending on the quality of the pig iron and the chemistry of the scrap and the humidity in the valley air, and who spent their careers learning to read a furnace the way a sailor reads a sky. The chief melter, the man responsible for the quality of the steel, was an aristocrat of the mill floor. He earned more than a teacher, often more than a doctor. He had knowledge that could not be written down, that lived entirely in his hands and his eyes and his 30 years of standing 6 feet from liquid metal. He could look at the color of a heat, the exact shade of orange and white and blue that played across the surface of the molten steel, and know within a margin of 10 degrees what the temperature was. His name is not in any history book. His grandson delivered mail in Munhall. That gap between what these men knew, what they built, what they gave, and what history chose to remember about them, is the wound at the center of this story. And it is a wound that never fully closed, not in the mill's lifetime, and not after. 1986, that is the year the open hearth furnaces at Homestead went cold for the last time. The official announcement came on a Thursday. USS, United States Steel, the corporate successor to Carnegie Steel, the entity that had owned the Homestead Works since 1901, issued a press release stating that it would be idling the open hearth division of the Homestead Works, citing changing market conditions and the need to consolidate operations in more cost-effective facilities. Idling, that word. They used the word idling the way a doctor uses the word discomfort to describe a procedure that will make you scream. It was designed to imply temporariness, flexibility, the possibility of reversal. It implied that the furnaces could be restarted, that the workers could be recalled, that this was a pause and not an ending. It was an ending. The workers knew it. The foreman knew it. The men who had spent 30 years learning to read a furnace by its color knew it in their bodies before they heard the words. They had been watching the signs for years. The deferred maintenance, the outdated equipment that was repaired instead of replaced, the slow creep of automation that took one job, then 3, then a dozen, and was never reversed. They knew. The politicians said otherwise. The politicians said this was temporary. The politicians talked about federal assistance, about retraining programs, about the possibility of new investment, about the global steel market and its cycles, and how Homestead would come back stronger when the cycle turned. The cycle did not turn, and the politicians, to their considerable credit as survivors if nothing else, found new things to talk about. But wait. Because here's what nobody tells you about the death of Homestead Steel, about why it happened when it happened, how it happened, and who exactly was steering the ship as it hit the rocks. The collapse of the Homestead Works was not an accident. It was not simply the result of foreign competition or outdated technology or the natural death of an industry past its prime. Those things were real. They were factors. But they were not the whole story, and they were certainly not the story that the men in the boardrooms of Pittsburgh and New York were telling themselves. The whole story involves a set of decisions, specific, deliberate, documented decisions, made by specific people, for specific reasons, that prioritized short-term financial engineering over long-term industrial survival. Decisions that extracted as much value as possible from the Homestead Works and its workers for as long as possible, and then walked away. And the people who made those decisions did not go to Homestead in 1986 and look the workers in the eyes when they announced the closures. They sent press releases. They hired consultants to handle the community relations. They collected their bonuses and went home to houses in neighborhoods where the word homestead was not spoken. Part 2, The Engine, Rise and the Battle That Changed Everything. July 6, 1892, 4 in the morning. The Monongahela River lies dark and still. 2 barges move upstream, carrying 310 armed men hired by the Pinkerton Agency. Many of them barely understand the situation, only that they've been promised work. But the workers are ready. They haven't just gone on strike. They've organized. They built patrol systems, communication networks, and an advisory committee that effectively governs the town. When the barges arrive, thousands are waiting on the shore. Shots are fired. No one agrees by whom. By sunrise, there are dead and wounded on both sides. The Pinkertons attempt to land, but are driven back by rifle fire, a makeshift cannon, and even a burning raft. By afternoon, they surrender. A private army has been defeated by steel workers. But the victory is brief. Within days, the Pennsylvania governor sends 8,000 National Guard troops. The workers do not resist. The mill reopens with replacement workers under military protection. By November, the union collapses. The strike is over. The union is broken. Carnegie Steel regains full control, now with a workforce stripped of bargaining power. Workers return because they must. The mill is their livelihood, their community, their identity. That is the logic of the company town. After 1892, the company deliberately reshapes its workforce. Skilled Irish and British union workers are replaced with immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe and black workers from the South. The goal is clear: divide the workforce and prevent future unity. And it works. The new workers enter a system designed to consume them, replaceable, expendable, valued only as inputs. But they still build something. A dense, multi-ethnic community of churches, shops, and social networks. Everything revolves around one thing: the mill. Who controls the mill controls everything. Through the Depression, recovery, and the New Deal, workers endure. In 1937, unions return, not through conflict, but because the company calculates it is more vigno to accept them. World War II brings peak production. Homestead becomes a critical supplier of steel for the war effort. Workers receive good wages and a sense of purpose, but no recognition beyond that. After the war, demand remains high, but the foundation is already weakening. In 1959, a massive steel strike shuts down production for 116 days. While U.S. mills sit idle, other countries rebuild with newer, more efficient technology. American companies, including U.S. Steel, have the resources to modernize, but choose not to. Instead, they prioritize profits, dividends, and diversification. This decision proves decisive. By the 1970s and 1980s, outdated mills like Homestead cannot compete. The result is inevitable: closure, layoffs, collapse of the local economy. But the worst part comes after. Not just the shutdown, but what follows. Years of failed redevelopment plans, political promises, and corporate maneuvering. The mill is not saved. It is stripped. And that leads to part 3. The decade of false hope, the fight over what remained, and the moment it became clear that Homestead was not being rebuilt, but dismantled. Part 3, the machinery of madness, collapse, stripping, and the decade of lies. Here is a number: 15,000. That is how many steelworkers lost their jobs in the Mon Valley between 1979 and 1987. Not across the country. Not across Pennsylvania. In the Mon Valley. In this one river valley, 20 miles long, southeast of Pittsburgh. 15,000 men and women who had spent their working lives inside mills that had, within living memory, outproduced entire nations. Gone. In less than a decade. The economists had a word for it. Deindustrialization. A smooth, academic word. A word that belongs in a textbook, in a footnote, in a conference paper delivered to people who had never stood 6 feet from an open hearth furnace and felt the hair on their arms disappear. A word that managed, with impressive efficiency, to remove all the human content from what was, in practical terms, a catastrophe. Not a natural catastrophe, not a hurricane, not a flood, not an earthquake, a man-made catastrophe. A catastrophe with authors, with architects, with people who knew exactly what they were doing and did it anyway, and who have never, not once, not in any forum, not in any court, been held accountable for what they did. That is the story of part 3. The authors of the catastrophe, and the men and women who were left to live inside it. Let's go back to 1979, because that is where you can first see the shape of what is coming, if you know what to look for. The Homestead Works, in 1979, employed approximately 10,000 people directly. Another 20,000 jobs in the Mon Valley, in suppliers, in service industries, in the entire ecosystem of commerce that grows up around a large industrial employer, depended on those 10,000. 30,000 jobs. In a valley where there was essentially no other large employer, where the mill was not just the dominant economic institution, but the only economic institution of any scale. The mill, in 1979, was still running, still producing steel, still paying wages that supported mortgages and car payments and parochial school tuitions and the annual vacation to the Jersey Shore. But something had shifted in the years since the 1959 strike, something that the workers felt in the quality of the maintenance, in the age of the equipment, in the particular silence that falls over a facility where management has stopped talking about the future. The equipment was old, not charmingly old, not historically significant old, just old. Open hearth furnaces that had been built in the 1920s and 1930s, repaired and patched and coaxed along for 50 years, running on technology that the rest of the industrial world had abandoned a decade earlier. Rolling equipment that vibrated in ways it shouldn't vibrate, that threw heat in directions it shouldn't throw heat, that required the accumulated knowledge of 30-year veterans to manage because the tolerances had drifted so far from their original specifications that only human expertise could compensate. U.S. Steel had not made a major capital investment in the Homestead Works since the early 1960s. 18 years. In an industry where the technology was transforming every decade, where the basic oxygen furnace and continuous casting were rewriting the economics of steel production from the ground up, the company that owned the most storied mill in American history had spent 18 years doing the absolute minimum required to keep the lights on. Why? Because the numbers still worked. Because an open hearth furnace that was paid off 40 years ago, staffed by workers whose wages were capped by a contract, producing steel for a domestic market that had not yet fully felt the pressure of foreign competition, still generated profit. Not the profit of a modernized facility, not competitive, sustainable, long-term profit, but profit. Quarterly profit. The kind of profit that looked good in an annual report, that kept the dividend payments flowing, that satisfied the people whose job was to be satisfied by quarterly numbers, and who did not particularly need to think about what those numbers would look like in 1985. This is what economists call extractive management. This is what workers call being bled dry. 1979 was also the year that U.S. Steel acquired Marathon Oil. $5.5 billion. The largest industrial acquisition in American history to that point. To put that number in context, a comprehensive modernization of the Homestead Works, new basic oxygen furnaces, continuous casting equipment, updated rolling technology, would have cost somewhere between $300 and $500 million. A fraction. A rounding error on the Marathon acquisition. The Board of U.S. Steel did not look at the Homestead Works and see a facility worth saving with $500 million of capital investment. They looked at it and saw a facility that could be squeezed for a few more years of profit, and then closed, and then sold for scrap, and then written off on the taxes. The chairman of U.S. Steel at the time was a man named David Roderick. David Roderick did not grow up in a steel mill. He grew up in Pittsburgh, the son of a doctor, educated at the University of Pittsburgh, trained as an accountant. He came up through the financial side of the corporation, not the production side. He understood steel the way a banker understands a loan, as an instrument, a vehicle, a thing whose value could be extracted and whose residual, once extraction was complete, could be disposed of. He was not a villain in the cartoonish sense. He was something more interesting and more dangerous than a cartoon villain. He was a man who was doing exactly what the incentive structure of American corporate capitalism in the late 1970s rewarded him for doing. He was maximizing shareholder value. He was making rational decisions with the tools and the metrics and the time frame that his board and his shareholders had given him. The fact that those tools and that time frame were catastrophically misaligned with the actual long-term interests of his company, his workers, his community, and arguably his country. That was not his problem. It was everyone else's. The first closure announcement came in November 1979. 13 plants across the U.S. steel system. Roughly 13,000 jobs. Homestead was not on the initial list. Not yet. But the men inside the mill felt the announcement land like a shift in atmospheric pressure. The feeling of a system that is beginning to fail. The specific, visceral dread of a man who has spent his entire adult life inside a single institution and who has just been given the first real evidence that the institution does not plan to last as long as he does. The union, the United Steelworkers, responded with the tools it had: negotiations, press releases, political lobbying, meetings with congressmen and senators from Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana who made sympathetic noises and did essentially nothing, because the political will to intervene in a corporate restructuring decision did not exist, had never really existed, and was not about to spontaneously generate itself in the early months of the Reagan administration. Ronald Reagan was inaugurated in January 1981. In August of that year, he fired 11,000 striking air traffic controllers and destroyed their union in a single afternoon. The message to every corporation in America that was considering how to handle its labor relations was not subtle. The closures accelerated. By 1983, U.S. Steel had idled or permanently closed facilities employing more than 100,000 workers across its system. 100,000 in 4 years. An industrial evacuation so rapid and so complete that the communities built around those facilities had no time to adapt, no runway for transition, no cushion of any kind between the last paycheck and the abyss. In the Mon Valley, the sequence went like this. The Duquesne Works closed. The McKeesport National Works closed. The Clairton Coke Works, the largest coke-producing facility in the world, reduced its workforce from 4,000 to 400. And the Homestead Works, which had survived the first wave, survived the second wave, which the workers and the union and the borough's elected officials had begun to interpret as a sign that Homestead was different, that Homestead was too productive, too storied, too historically significant to close. The Homestead Works was not different. It just took longer. The open hearth furnaces at Homestead were idled in 1983. Not closed, idled. That word again. The word that meant, we are not quite ready to tell you the truth. The structural and rail mill kept running. The plate mill kept running. Skeleton crew, reduced hours. The quality of the equipment degrading steadily as maintenance budgets were cut to the bone and then through the bone. Workers who had been on the payroll for 20 years were offered buyouts, lump sums that looked generous until you divided them by the number of working years those men had expected to have ahead of them. Workers who refused the buyouts stayed on, watching the mill hollow out around them, coming to work in buildings where half the equipment had been shut down and the silence was wrong, was the silence of absence rather than the silence of a place at rest. The social consequences hit the borough immediately. Property values collapsed. Not gradually, collapsed. A house in Homestead that had been worth $60,000 in 1980 was worth $20,000 in 1985 and falling. Businesses on 8th Avenue began closing, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, the way a tide goes out. The Slovak Fraternal Hall cut its events calendar. The Hungarian church lost a third of its congregation to out-migration in 2 years. The ward, Homestead's black neighborhood, which had always been economically marginal, which had always existed at the outer edge of the mill's prosperity rather than at its center, was devastated in a way that was qualitatively different from the devastation visited on the white neighborhoods. Because the black workers of Homestead had had fewer years to accumulate, had been last hired and first fired for 3 generations, had been excluded from the full pension benefits that white workers had built up over 30 years, had been steered into the most dangerous, least promotable positions in the mill by a combination of union seniority rules and management practice that had only partially changed even after the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. They had less cushion. They fell faster. And nobody, not U.S. Steel, not the union, not the politicians, not the newspapers, was paying particular attention to how fast they were falling. 1986. The last operating divisions of the Homestead Works were shut down. The announcement was made on a Thursday. By Friday morning, the men who had been reporting to that mill for 20, 25, 30 years We're standing outside a locked gate looking at a building that was, for the first time in over a century, silent. Not quiet. Silent. There is a difference. A steel mill is never quiet. Even when it is running at reduced capacity, even in the hours between shifts, it produces sound, the deep mechanical respiration of industrial equipment, the creak and groan of massive structures expanding and contracting with temperature changes, the distant clang of metal on metal that is so constant, so omnipresent, that the people who work there stop hearing it consciously and only notice it in its absence. The workers who stood outside the Homestead Works on that Friday morning heard the absence. Some of them had never, in 30 years, heard that particular silence from outside that gate. Some of them stood there for a long time. Then they went home. Now here's where it gets dark, because the closure was not the end. The closure was, in some ways, the beginning of a new and separate catastrophe, one that unfolded not in the mill, but in the rooms where decisions were made about what to do with the mill's carcass, and in the streets and the community centers and the church halls where the workers and their families tried to figure out how to survive what had just happened to them. The mill sat idle for several years. Not empty, idle. Equipment still in place, furnaces still standing, the whole massive infrastructure of the place still physically present, still capable, in theory, of being restarted or rebuilt or reimagined into something. U.S. Steel was paying property taxes on it. U.S. Steel was paying a skeleton maintenance crew to keep the buildings from deteriorating faster than they naturally would. U.S. Steel was also simultaneously conducting what it called a strategic assessment of the property. A strategic assessment. Translation: figuring out how to sell it. The developer who enters the story at this point is a man named Park Martin. Not Park Martin the individual, Park Martin the archetype. Because what came to Homestead in the late 1980s and early 1990s was not one developer, not one plan, not one vision for what the 40-plus acres of the most historically significant industrial site in America could become. What came was a succession of developers, each with a plan, each with renderings, each with a press conference and a handshake with a politician and a set of promises that were, in retrospect, always somewhat more about creating the conditions for the developer to profit than about creating anything durable for the community. The first serious proposal, the one that generated the most excitement, the one that the local newspapers covered with something approaching genuine hope, was for a mixed-use redevelopment, housing, retail, a riverfront park, perhaps a museum honoring the mill's history, perhaps some light industrial space for small manufacturers who could build on the legacy of the site's industrial heritage. It was a good proposal. It was, in several important respects, the right proposal. It died. Not because it was unfeasible, not because the economics were impossible. It died because the entities with power over the site, U.S. Steel, the state government, the county, the federal economic development agencies, could not align their interests long enough to make it happen. U.S. Steel wanted top dollar for the property. The state wanted federal money to leverage its own investment. The county wanted the tax revenue from whatever came next. The federal agencies had their own criteria, their own timelines, their own political pressures. The community, the workers, the borough government, the neighborhood organizations, was consulted in the way that communities are always consulted in these processes, asked for input at public meetings that were designed to produce the appearance of participation rather than its substance, and then largely ignored when the actual decisions were made. This went on for years. A decade of proposals, a decade of meetings, a decade of renderings on the walls of the Homestead High School gymnasium, each one slightly different from the last. Each one presented by someone in a suit who was new to the room. Each one promising something that the previous rendering had also promised and that had not materialized. Meanwhile, the mill sat, and while the mill sat, the buildings deteriorated. Steel structures that had been maintained through continuous operation, that had been kept functional, essentially, by the heat of the furnaces that had run inside them for decades, were now exposed to the full force of a western Pennsylvania climate without the internal heat that had always compensated for the cold. Roofs leaked, foundations settled. The floors of the rolling mills, saturated with decades of industrial lubricants and process chemicals, began to do things that cost money to address. The longer the mill sat, the more expensive it became to do anything with it. The more expensive it became to do anything with it, the harder it was to find a developer willing to take on the liability. The harder it was to find a developer willing to take on the liability, the more the property values in the surrounding borough continued to fall. It was a loop with no exit built into it, unless someone decided to build one. The decision, when it came, was made in Pittsburgh and in Harrisburg and in the offices of a non-profit economic development corporation called the Steel of America Development Corporation, later renamed the Redevelopment Authority of Allegheny County, because the original name was perhaps too honest about what was actually being developed, which was not steel and not America, but real estate. The decision was demolish, not selectively, not preserve the historically significant structures, demolish the unsafe ones, retain the bones of the place as the foundation for something that honored what had been here. Demolish everything. The open hearth furnaces that had produced more steel than Great Britain, the blast furnaces that had run continuously for 60 years, the plate mill, the structural mill, the machine shops, the administrative buildings, the water tower, the railroad infrastructure. The entire physical record of what had been, by any honest reckoning, the most important industrial site in American history. All of it. The justification was environmental remediation, which was real. The site was genuinely contaminated with heavy metals and process chemicals and the accumulated industrial residue of 100 years of steel production, and that contamination had to be addressed before any new development could happen. That much was true. But environmental remediation does not require demolition. Environmental remediation requires cleanup of soil, of groundwater, of the specific contaminated areas of the site. It does not require taking down every structure, selling the steel for scrap, and erasing the physical evidence of everything that happened here. That part was a choice that was extremely convenient for several parties. The scrap value of the steel structures at the Homestead Works was significant. Tens of millions of dollars at the scrap steel prices of the early 1990s. That scrap value helped finance the demolition itself, which helped make the economics of the remediation work on paper, which helped secure the government funding that made the whole project viable. In other words, the mill paid for its own demolition. The workers who built it watched it happen. The demolition of the Homestead Works took several years, proceeding in stages, beginning with the oldest and most deteriorated structures and working toward the operational heart of the complex. The workers and former workers of the borough watched from the hillsides. Some of them watched from their front porches, because the hills above the river valley in Homestead are steep and close, and the views down to the mill site are unobstructed, and on a clear day in 1992 or 1993 or 1994, you could sit on your porch and watch a crane take down a building that you had worked in for 20 years. The sound was wrong. Not the sound of industry, not the deep, purposeful sound of productive machinery, the sound of destruction, the flat, percussive sound of structural steel being cut, being brought down, being broken apart by machines operated by men who had nothing to do with the mill, who had no relationship with what they were demolishing, who were simply doing their jobs. The former workers named the buildings as they came down. Not formally, not for the record, but among themselves, in the bars on 8th Avenue and on those front porches and in the parking lot of the Union Hall, they named the buildings as they fell. They said, "That's number 4 Open Hearth. That's the Blooming Mill. That's the machine shop where Tony Kowalski worked for 30 years. That's the building where Mike Petrovich's father was killed in 1947, and his death was recorded as an industrial accident, and nobody was ever held accountable." They named them because the official process was not naming them. The official process was not documenting what was being lost. The official process was focused, understandably and appropriately, on what was coming next, on the redevelopment plan, on the environmental timeline, on the financing structure, on the negotiations between the various government agencies and the development authority about who was going to pay for what. The past was not the official process's problem. The past was being dealt with by the demolition contractors. There was a group of former workers and local historians who tried to save something. They were called, at various points, the Steel Industry Heritage Corporation, or the River of Steel Heritage Area Advocates, or simply, among themselves, the people who were trying to make sure this didn't just disappear. They fought for a museum. They fought for the preservation of at least some of the significant structures: the pump house, some of the furnace infrastructure, the administrative building that Carnegie had built with the same paradoxical generosity that characterized all his public philanthropy. They collected oral histories. They photographed everything they could get access to. They argued at public meetings with planners and developers and government officials who nodded politely and continued doing what they had already decided to do. They saved some things. The pump house survived. A handful of furnace stacks were retained as sculptural elements in the eventual park. The Carnegie Library, already a protected historic structure, survived. A small section of the waterfront was eventually developed as a river heritage site. They did not save the mill. Nobody was going to save the mill. The mill was too big, too contaminated, too expensive, too inconvenient to the financial logic of what was planned for the site. And what was planned for the site? What was eventually built on the ground where 10,000 men had worked, where the Allies had won a war, where workers had faced down a private army and briefly held the most powerful industrialist in the world at a standstill, was a shopping center. The waterfront. Opened in 1999. Costco. Home Depot. Lowe's Cineplex. Applebee's. A Barnes and Noble. The full constellation of late 20th century American retail, arrayed along a riverbank that had been cleared of everything that made it specific, that made it different from every other brownfield redevelopment project in every other post-industrial American city. A place without memory, by design. But here is what the official story of the Homestead redevelopment, the press releases, the ribbon-cutting ceremonies, the economic development reports, does not tell you. The waterfront did not revitalize Homestead. The waterfront revitalized the tax base of the township of Munhall, which is the municipality within which the former mill site technically falls, and which is not the same as the borough of Homestead, and which had, conveniently, lower property tax rates that made it more attractive to the commercial developers who built the waterfront. The borough of Homestead, the actual community that had been built by and around the mill, that had housed the workers and their families for 100 years, that had sustained 8th Avenue and the ward and the Slovak fraternal halls and the Hungarian churches, received essentially none of the direct economic benefit from the waterfront development. The waterfront shoppers came off the highway. They parked in the surface lots of the waterfront. They shopped at Costco and ate at Applebee's and went home. They did not go to 8th Avenue. They did not stop in the borough of Homestead. They did not know, in most cases, that the borough of Homestead existed, or that what they were standing on, what they were rolling their shopping carts across, was the ground where American industrial history had been made and unmade within living memory. They were shopping, and the borough of Homestead, a quarter-mile away from the largest retail development in the Mon Valley, was still losing population, still losing businesses, still watching its property values fall and its tax base shrink and its schools deteriorate and its social fabric fray in the specific, slow, grinding way that post-industrial communities fray when the thing that made them cohere is gone and nothing has come to replace it. The politicians had called it a revitalization. The word revitalization means to give new life to. The life in question, the life of the community that had actually existed here, that had been built by the Jans and the Mihails and the men and women of the ward and the children of the Slovak and Polish and Serbian immigrants who had spent their working lives inside those furnaces. That life was not the object of revitalization. That life was the thing that had been in the way. And in Part 4, we will follow what happened to the people who were in the way. The former steelworkers and their families, the community organizations, the union halls and the churches and the neighborhood institutions that tried to survive the transition, and the specific, brutal human mathematics of what it costs a community to lose the thing that made it a community. Part 4, The Reckoning. What it costs to lose everything. Here is what nobody puts in an economic development report. The suicide rate in the Mon Valley doubled between 1979 and 1987. Not climbed, not increased, doubled in 8 years. In a valley where the men who were losing their jobs were the sons and grandsons of men who had defined themselves, completely, entirely, without apology, by the work they did and the mill they did it in. Work was not what these men did. Work was what these men were. And when the work ended, something else ended with it. Something that no retraining program, no government assistance package, no well-intentioned community development initiative could address, because it wasn't an economic problem. It was an identity problem, a meaning problem. The particular devastating emptiness of a man who has spent 30 years being essential and has just been told, by the closing of a gate, that he is not. The economists had a term for this too: structural unemployment. Clean. Bloodless. 2 words that contained, without touching, the reality of a 52-year-old steelworker sitting in his kitchen at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, listening to the silence where the mill sounds used to be, trying to figure out what he was supposed to do now. The retraining programs arrived. Federal money, state money, foundation money, channeled through community colleges and workforce development agencies, and a rotating cast of nonprofit organizations with names that were variations on the words new and future and opportunity. Computer skills, customer service, healthcare aid certification. The men who took these programs were, in the main, grateful for them. They were not stupid men. They understood that the mill was not coming back, that the world had changed, that the skills that had made them valuable inside a steel mill had limited transferability to the service economy that was, theoretically, replacing it. They understood all of this, and they sat in the community college classrooms, and they learned what they were taught. And then they entered a labor market that was paying $12 an hour for the jobs they were being trained for, having come from jobs that paid, in 1985 dollars, the equivalent of 30. The math did not work. It was never going to work. Not because the men were inadequate, because the replacement economy being offered to the Mon Valley was not, in any honest accounting, a replacement. It was a consolation, a structural demotion dressed up in the language of opportunity. The women of Homestead rarely appear in the histories. They should be centered. Because the women of Homestead, the wives, the daughters, the mothers of the men who lost their jobs, were managing the economic crisis at ground level, in real time, without the social permission to fall apart, that the culture, to some limited extent, extended to their husbands. They went back to work. Or they worked more. Or they took the second job and the third job and managed the household on a fraction of what the household had previously run on, and they did this while also managing the psychological consequences of what was happening to their families. The depression, the drinking that the script is not going to dwell on, but that was real and present and devastating. The particular violence that poverty and humiliation and loss of purpose can produce in men who were never given any vocabulary for what they were feeling. The women held it together, with their hands, with their ingenuity, with the networks of mutual support that had always run through the community, the church networks, the neighborhood networks, the informal systems of shared childcare and food and information that women build in places where formal institutions are inadequate. They held it together, and they are not on any monument, and their names are not in any history book, and the Costco on the waterfront was not built in their honor. The ward deteriorated fastest. Homestead's black neighborhood, already the most economically vulnerable part of the community, already carrying the compounded disadvantage of decades of discriminatory hiring and wage suppression and exclusion from the full benefits of union membership, lost its economic foundation completely and had the fewest resources to fall back on. The businesses closed. The institutions struggled. The population fell as younger residents left for Pittsburgh, for other cities, for anywhere that had jobs. What remained was a neighborhood in the specific condition of abandonment, not emptied, not dead, but hollowed. Buildings occupied and buildings vacant in an unpredictable checkerboard. Institutions running on volunteer energy and the stubbornness of people who had been there for 40 years and were not leaving because leaving would mean that everything they had built meant nothing. It meant something. But meaning, without resources, without investment, without any of the political attention that was being lavished on the waterfront development a quarter-mile away, is not enough to hold a neighborhood together. The ward needed money. The money went to the waterfront. Fast forward to 2005. The waterfront is open, successful by retail metrics, generating sales tax revenue and employment at wages that are, for the most part, not the wages of a steel mill. The pump house on the river has been converted into a small event space. A trail runs along the riverbank. On a summer evening, it is genuinely pleasant. The water moving, the hills green, the old furnace stacks preserved as industrial sculpture catching the last of the light. It is a park. A nice park. carved from 40 acres of ground that was once the most productive industrial site in the world. The former workers who are still alive, the men in their 60s and 70s, the ones who didn't take early buyouts or couldn't find other work or spent years fighting through the retraining and the reinvention and ended up somewhere workable, if not what they'd expected. Some of them walk the trail. Some of them stop at the preserved furnace stacks and look up. They don't say much. There is a particular kind of grief that has no performance mode, that has been lived with so long it no longer announces itself. That grief is what they carry to that riverbank. And what they are looking at, the manicured park, the parking lots, the chain restaurants, the complete absence of any physical evidence that something enormous and irreplaceable was here, tells them, one more time, what they already know. That it was decided, at some level, that their story was not worth keeping. That the place where they spent their lives was worth more as square footage than as memory. That the men who made those decisions, the corporate executives, the development authority boards, the politicians who gave speeches about revitalization and then went home, were not going to be the ones living with the consequences. The consequences are these. The borough of Homestead today has a population of roughly 3,000 people. In 1940, it had 18,000. The schools are underfunded. The housing stock is aging. 8th Avenue, which was once 40 blocks of dense commercial activity, has blocks where the storefronts are empty and have been empty for 15 years. The opioid crisis, which hit post-industrial communities in the Mon Valley earlier and harder than almost anywhere else in the country, has taken people from families that had already been depleted by the mill closures. Grandchildren of the steelworkers, growing up in communities that had lost their economic purpose and their social infrastructure in the same decade, reached for what was available. This is what structural unemployment looks like 20 years later. This is what it costs to dismantle a community's economic foundation and replace it with a retail development that doesn't serve the community. This is the bill. And it is still being paid. By the people who didn't make the decisions. Part 5. The final irony. What we chose to forget. Go to Homestead today and ask someone under 30 what happened here. Most of them will know there used to be a mill. Some of them will know there was a strike. Something about the 1800s. Something about Pinkertons. A few will know someone whose grandfather worked there. Almost none of them will know that what was demolished on this riverbank was the industrial foundation of the most powerful nation in the history of the world. That the steel that built modern America, its bridges, its skyscrapers, its warships, its railroads, came, in enormous measure, from this specific bend in this specific river. That forgetting is not an accident. Forgetting, at this scale, requires effort. Here is the final irony. America spent the entire 20th century telling a story about itself. A story about industry and ingenuity and the dignity of work. About the men and women who built the country with their hands. About the moral seriousness of manufacturing as the backbone of national power. It told this story in presidential speeches and union halls and 4th of July parades. It put steelworkers on postage stamps. And then, when it was economically convenient, it demolished the places those steelworkers had worked, replaced them with parking lots, and continued telling the story as if the places still existed. The story survived the demolition. The community did not. The men who made the decisions, the executives who chose shareholder dividends over capital investment, the developers who chose retail over preservation, the politicians who chose ribbon cuttings over accountability. Those men retired comfortably. David Roderick, the U.S. Steel chairman who presided over the dismantling, lived to 83. He is remembered in the business press as a tough but necessary restructurer who saved the company from a worse fate. The workers he restructured are not remembered in the business press. They are remembered on the front porches of the hillside houses above the Monongahela, in the conversations of the people who stayed, in the specific, unrecorded way that communities remember things that the official history chose not to. Petro Kovalenko's grandson lives in Pittsburgh now, works in healthcare, drives past the waterfront sometimes on his way to visit family in Munhall. Doesn't stop. He knows what's under the parking lot. There is a small museum. The Rivers of Steel National Heritage Area maintains a site at the Bost Building, a former Union headquarters on 8th Avenue that survived the demolitions and was eventually restored. Inside, photographs, artifacts, oral history recordings, the voices of men who worked the open hearths, who survived the 1892 battle, who came to Homestead from Slovakia and Ukraine and Alabama and built their lives inside those walls. It is worth visiting. It is also, at roughly 3,000 square feet, approximately 1/10,000th the size of the facility it commemorates. The commemoration is proportional to what was politically convenient to commemorate. The inconvenient parts, the corporate decisions, the political failures, the racial inequities, the deliberate extraction and abandonment of a community, those parts require more than a museum. They require an honest reckoning with a pattern that did not end in Homestead in 1986 and has not ended anywhere since. The pattern is this: find a community built around a single large employer. Extract value from that employer for as long as the extraction is profitable. When the extraction becomes unprofitable, close the employer, blame global forces, offer retraining programs as a gesture toward conscience, and redevelop the physical site for a use that generates tax revenue without generating community. Call it revitalization. Move on. This pattern has a name in the academic literature. In the lived experience of the people it happens to, it has a different name. It has the name of every closed mill, every shuttered mine, every emptied factory town in the American interior where the population has been falling for 40 years, and the median age is climbing, and the young people leave and don't come back because there is nothing to come back to. It has the name Homestead. Go back to where we started. The Costco on the waterfront, the minivans in the parking lot, the shopping carts rolling across asphalt laid over ground that was once covered by the largest steel mill in the history of the world. The families loading bulk groceries into their trunks, completely unaware, because why would they be aware? Nobody told them that they are standing on the exact spot where, in July of 1892, workers armed with rifles and a cannon held off a private army for an entire day and night and proved, briefly and brilliantly, that organized people could stand against organized capital and win. They didn't win in the end, but they stood. And that standing, that refusal, that morning on the riverbank, that specific act of collective courage by men whose names are not on any monument within 100 miles of here, that is the thing that was buried deepest when the demolition crews came through. Not the furnaces, not the rolling mills, not the open hearths. The memory of what people are capable of when they decide that enough is enough. That is what the parking lot is built on. That is what we chose to pave over. And that single choice, repeated in Youngstown, in Gary, in Detroit, in every post-industrial American community where the powerful decided that the past was an inconvenience and the future was a real estate opportunity. tells you more about who we are and what we value than any speech, any monument, any postage stamp with a steelworker on it ever could. The furnaces are gone. The men who tended them are mostly gone. The borough is still here, still standing, like it always did.